Well, hello everyone again. Welcome to the Balance webinar, New Year, New You, Anti-Diet. My name is Ekin. I am an intake coordinator here at Balance, and I will be your moderator for the day. Just a little bit about Balance. We're in an outpatient facility. We have levels ranging from PHP all the way down to individual care. And now that most people are here, we can start getting started. Thank you so much for taking the time to log on today and learn more about this topic. Just by tuning in and putting your energy towards learning about yourself and getting this type of support that maybe you or someone you know may need is just awesome. You're definitely in the right place and you are definitely welcome here. We are so happy to have you. And if you have any sort of questions, like I had said, the Q&A function is a great place to add those. And definitely just reactions and thoughts throughout in the chat would be awesome. And we'll have questions throughout, mainly towards the end as well, but please do not be shy. We love hearing from you, and this is just such an awesome opportunity to connect and inform. And I would love to introduce our presenter for today. This is Chloe Cerino, one of our registered dietitians here at Balance. Chloe.
Thank you so much, Ekin. So as Ekin said, my name is Chloe Cerino. I'm one of the registered dietitians here at Balance. Talking about topics like this, anything anti-diet, intuitive eating is really what I'm passionate about. So I'm thrilled to be joining you all today to talk about this very cool and very important topic. So as Ekin said, feel free to put any questions in that Q&A function. It's easier to put them in there than the chat, just so we're sure that we can get to your question. They don't get lost in the chat. And we will be taking some questions throughout, others at the end. So thank you all for your participation. All right. So just to go into an overview of what we're going to be talking about together today. So of course it's still early January. I guess we're approaching mid-January. So we are surrounded by New Year's resolutions and all of the things that kind of come along with that. So that's going to be kind of our primary focus today, is just focusing on classic New Year's resolutions, how diet culture might kind of tie into that, why diets don't work, and then setting more centered or long-term resolutions instead. So without further ado, some typical resolutions that I think we really see when we enter, end of December, early January, are ones that are like these. So some examples might be read 100 books, improve my mental health, find myself. I think that's a big one that we see. Sort out finances, cut back on spending, maybe lose some weight, I think is a really common one. Travel more or find the one. All pretty typical New Year's resolutions, kind of in that really broad fashion that we see come this time of year. So I'm curious, what do we see that these typical resolutions kind of have in common? So feel free to take a minute to think about that, put it in the chat if you have any thoughts. So when we think about these more typical resolutions, they tend to be really general, right? When we were looking at those, it was like, figure out my finances, find myself, things that are super broad. And when they are this broad, it can be really hard to track them and to know if we're actually taking the steps that would be required to meet those longer term goals. They also tend to go kind of from 0 to 100, meaning that, instead of saying, I'm going to really be mindful about how often I go to Starbucks during the week, I'm going to never go to Starbucks again. I'm going to stop buying lattes altogether. So of course, when we're setting these really lofty and dramatic, sometimes radical goals, it's setting you up for failure a lot of the time, right? Because it would be really challenging when your friend texts you to ask you to go to Starbucks to pass up on that option. And then what happens is we go and then we feel like everything goes out the window. So it's not necessarily setting yourself up for success by setting these really radical goals. Along the similar vein, they tend to be not particularly bound to time. So not saying, by the end of January or in the next however many weeks, I'm going to choose to make these couple of changes. They tend to be more, by the end of 2022, I'm going to have found myself, which is just too broad for us to really have a good grasp on. These resolutions also tend to kind of have the through line of fixing yourself or needing to kind of reinvent yourself in the new year. I'm sure you can kind of understand from the title that we maybe are against the new year, new you mentality, just because it's the new year, you don't need to completely change yourself, fix yourself, or do anything like that. So we would be remiss to not talk about diet culture as part of all of this, and in particular, media literacy. So this time of year, whenever we open up social media, open up print media, turn on the news, it's more likely than not that you're seeing either advertisements for something that is related to diet culture, or even just pictures that kind of are promoting diet culture in general. So January media really, as I said, tends to focus on it's time to fix yourself. It's a new year. It's a clean slate. And while in some ways, I think that clean slate mentality can be helpful, really needing to think about like, there's so much pressure to completely fix yourself, completely change, reinvent yourself in the new year, maybe is applying a little too much pressure. And it's maybe not super realistic or even necessary. So when we think about media literacy, what this means is really being a conscious consumer of media. So when I say consumer, I don't necessarily mean someone who's purchasing things, just someone who's taking in this media. So as I mentioned before, in the new year, we tend to be, really bombarded with all of this kind of diet culture stuff. So whether that's an advertisement specifically, or just the images or stories that we're seeing out there, it tends to be really deeply rooted in diet culture thoughts and beliefs, which we'll go a little bit further into later. But part of being a conscious consumer is really taking that opportunity when you see anything in the media to really analyze it a little bit. So not just saying, I see this and I'm taking it as fact, saying, I see that this picture exists, this news story exists, and what is the reality behind it? So we know that we live in a society that tends to really rely on the use of Photoshop, Facetune, filters, even lighting and angles. When we're thinking about the media that's out there, it tends to be a really polished or even falsified version of the people and the stories that we're seeing. So instead of just taking everything at face value and saying this is 100% true just because I'm seeing it on Instagram or I'm seeing it in a magazine or something like that, taking the step back and saying, is it possible that there are any parts of this that aren't necessarily true or aren't necessarily telling me the whole picture? So once we do that, we can really decide if this is information that is relevant to us or that we want to internalize. So I think a lot of the time when we're engaging with media, specifically social media, there can be that strong urge to compare yourself to what you're seeing. And so doing this little exercise and taking the moment to analyze what you're seeing gives you the opportunity to say, am I even, if I am feeling that urge to engage in comparison, is what I'm comparing myself to even real? Is it even, the accurate picture, the full story? More often than not, it's not going to be. There's going to be some pieces of that are fictionalized or in some other way, just not completely accurate to the situation. So this is particularly true for those like new year, new me kinds of ads. I think we're being bombarded with a lot of before and after pictures right now, which we know often are really relying on Photoshop, angles, lighting, all of that kind of stuff. And even just the advertisements that we see. Of course, all of these companies, influencers, whatever it might be, are trying to sell you a product. So they're going to pick out those pictures or those stories or case studies that are aligned with what they're trying to sell you. So just something to think about while you're consuming any sort of media, in particular social media. I also wanted to take a moment to note that what we have more exposure to in any part of our life, what we have more exposure to, we're more likely to see as good or real or true. And this is just because our brains don't particularly love novel experiences. So the less novel or new that something is, the more our brain sees it as positive or appropriate or true. So this can happen when we're kind of scrolling the social feeds and we're seeing, a whole bunch of ads. And even if you take a couple of seconds of a pause on something, the algorithms more often than not are learning that, oh, Chloe paused on this advertisement or this post. This must be something she's interested in. Let's show her more of that, right? Because they want to show you what you're interested in. And so then kind of we get more and more of that exposure. And our brains are kind of taking that in as a less novel experience and therefore more likely to be good, positive, true. So just something to be mindful of when you are engaging with social media. On the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about how we can offset that a bit. So we're not as vulnerable to that kind of algorithm type stuff that we often hear about on social media. Okay, so when we're engaging with social, it's important to remember that what we are seeing, as I mentioned before, is the shiniest version of oneself or one's company or whatever it might be. I think in the more recent past, there's been somewhat of a push to show your real self on social media, but Instagram and other forms of social media really still do tend to be what we consider like a highlight reel, right? So even if someone is laying in bed on a lazy, rainy Sunday, having a cup of tea, it's unlikely they're posting a picture of that, but maybe you're posting a picture of their very cool vacation to Paris they took. And so when we're just not really analyzing the media we're consuming, we're saying, gosh, this person is always somewhere cool. They're always traveling. They have the best experiences. They have so many friends. And in actuality, maybe that's not telling the whole story. And I think it can be fine to want to post the very cool things you do in your life. Just as consumers, we need to be mindful of the fact that maybe it's not telling the whole story. And then to take that a step further, like again, I talked about a little on the last slide, we are seeing the highlight reel, and that highlight reel is Photoshop, face-tuned, using filters, etc. So we just need to be conscious consumers when we're looking at media of any kind. So as far as the algorithms go on social media, first I want to say I'm certainly not an expert in this, but as a social media user myself, and what I hear about from clients and also more specifically like in the research, we can offset what the algorithms show us. As I said, they want to show us what we're interested in. That just is how they keep us coming back. And so in order to really tailor our own social feeds to what we want them to say, sometimes that does involve a little bit of conscious work to tell the algorithm what we're interested in. So usually on Instagram and some other social sites, there will be an option, usually it'll look like a couple of dots right above the post, where you can either tell the social website that you're not interested in that post, and it'll usually ask you why you're not interested in it. Or you can even take it a step further and actually report that post or advertisement, I should say as well. I think this can be a really powerful tool for not only helping your own feed, but helping, just develop social sites into a more healthy and productive place, because there's even an option to report that it can promote disordered eating, which I think in our specific sphere, that can be a really, really helpful tool to use if you feel comfortable doing it. All right, keep moving. So why the pressure to change in January? Why are we being bombarded with all of these diet ads, before and after pictures, all of these things? And the answer is sales and marketing, which it usually is for many parts of our lives. So the diet industry is a $71 billion industry that grows and grows every year. And they really profit off our insecurities, right? So they're choosing to create a problem and tell us that, we need to follow this new diet, or we need to do something else to change ourselves or change our lives, so they can sell us the solution. We know that there is an increase in ads for diet companies in gyms in late December and early January, and throughout January, actually, I should say, because they know, right, that this is the time that people tend to be interested in this kind of stuff. So again, they're going to take that moment to capitalize on it. I think it's interesting that 20% of people that were surveyed in a Forbes study were setting the New Year's resolution to lose weight. So of course, this is obviously very intertwined with the diet industry. So I mean, the diet companies would be remiss to not take that opportunity, right? And say 20% of people who read this major magazine are setting the goal to lose weight. Let's advertise to them. So again, just another reason to be really conscious when we are consuming media, especially in the new year. So diet culture, clearly, as we've talked about, is the biggest culprit of this whole new year, new you kind of thing. Diet culture is just this ingrained set of beliefs that, you know, thin is the ideal, fatness is bad, which I think can be so harmful. And really just this general swamp that we tend to live in like the wellness kind of culture. That's just idealizing body shape or size over true health and well-being. So oftentimes these New Year's resolutions or the advertisements that we're seeing in the new year aren't focusing on improving your well-being overall, your mental health, things like that. It's focusing on how you can change your body shape or size. So that's often a way that we can identify diet culture in these things, is that, you know, they're operating under the guise of maybe trying to change your health. Maybe every so often they'll throw in some actual health marker that someone thinks that they got from following some diet. But in actuality, they're trying to sell you something to make you want to change your body shape or size, as evidenced by the before and after pictures they're using for these, right? And the numbers that they're using. So diet culture really is at the soul of all of this. So how can we spot diet culture? So as I mentioned before, diet culture is a set of beliefs that really value appearance, thinness, body shape, and size over true health and well-being. So we know that body shape and size, number on the scale, all of that are not the same thing as health and well-being. There are so many facets of health, and diet culture really tries to co-opt that and say, you need to change what you look like or change the number on the scale and your entire life will change. And we know that that's not true by any stretch of the imagination. Diet culture rests on the idea that there's something morally superior about being thin, which again is a very scary thought. And really just valuing that over everything instead of focusing on someone's mental health, physical health in a lot of ways, spiritual health, and all of the other facets of oneself. And usually this kind of shows up through promoting negative self-talk, promoting use of disordered eating behaviors, like maybe being mindful of information on nutrition facts labels, for example, focusing on the number on the scale, things like that, that are just kind of frivolous information versus true health markers, essentially. And we have another entire webinar about, actually, we probably have several on the Balance YouTube that talks even more about diet culture. So if you're curious about diving deeper into this, I'm sure someone can probably share the Balance YouTube channel link. So in the new year, the diet industry works overtime to really make you think that there's a problem so they can sell you the solution, right? And this happens throughout the year. And as I said, tends to just kind of crop up even more in the new year, because that's when people really are diving deep into this stuff. They use that clean slate mentality that, mind you, even diet culture has created that idea that there is a clean slate and you need to do some fixing in the new year. And also, I think they often see it as this opportune time that it's following the holidays, right? So diet culture loves to talk about how food eaten at the holidays, other habits that take place over the holidays are bad in some way and that we need to make up for it. We need to get back on track after the holiday season. And what better time than New Year's Eve, coming a week after Christmas, if that's a holiday that you celebrate, for them to talk about, you just did this over the holiday season. Here's the product we can sell you to get back on track with that. There's never anything that you need to get back on track from. There's no earning or burning food that we eat. There are no good or bad foods. And so the diet industry and diet culture in general really want to sell you on this idea that, in fact, maybe what you did over the holiday season is morally less superior than the new you that you can be in the new year. Okay. So spotting diet culture. As I just mentioned, the need to bounce back after the holidays is something that I think the diet companies love to say. It's really completely inaccurate and just, it can be really harmful to true health. And again, that's a place that we know that the diet companies and the diet industry are not looking out for our best interests, because they're actually trying to sell us on something that can be detrimental to our health in the long term. They're creating fears around food, like, for example, the holiday foods, I think, tend to be the big one, of saying, what you ate is shameful or bad in some way. You need to not eat that way, essentially. So here's the products we can sell you to kind of get back on track. And they are talking about these rapid changes. So oftentimes the diet advertisements, I think that we in particular see more so on television than on social, are focusing on like lose X number of pounds or make this rapid change in X number of weeks, months, whatever it might be, that we know is just completely rooted in diet culture, not sustainable, and really just trying to sell you on that quick, rapid fix that people often are looking for in the new year. I think something we need to be particularly mindful of both this year and in the last couple of years, and I imagine probably in the next few years, is as intuitive eating is gaining notoriety, these companies are learning that, right? They're learning that more people are talking about intuitive eating. And so therefore they want to use that kind of language, terminology, some of the like really broad principles, and put them into their advertising. So people say, I think I want to focus on intuitive eating. Oh, Noom is advertising to me as someone who, focuses on mindfulness, hunger and fullness cues, things like that. When in actuality, Noom is a diet, just like any other diet.
Yes,
and finally,
Chloe.
just as high, yep.
Sorry, to piggyback off of Noom, we have a question about Noom, actually. Noom is advertised as sustainable and healthy. So how can you spot that as diet culture, and how do you tell others that that's detrimental to your health?
It's a great question. So to use Noom as a specific example, they are advertising as that. If you Google anti-diet, I'm pretty sure that Noom comes up for like everybody, because they are advertising as not a diet. So sometimes it takes a little bit of digging and investigating, right? Because it's natural for us to be curious. And so if we're Googling anti-diet and this comes up, we're probably going to want to click it. So some red flags for what kind of a diet masquerading as intuitive eating would be is if they're still using good or bad foods. I think that's a big one, and I know Noom does that. If they're telling you to eat a certain amount or not eat certain foods, that would be counter to intuitive eating and the whole anti-diet sphere. Because really within intuitive eating, we're focusing on our own selves, being the experts on our own bodies. We know what, when, and how much to eat, whereas a diet is telling us what, when, and how much to eat. So if there's any kind of that, so even like Weight Watchers with a point system, for example, that's not being intuitive, because it's saying you can eat whatever you want, but it's just has to fit into this really narrow mold of what we're telling you to do. It's still prescriptive. So I think those are probably the two biggest red flags. And just having weight loss as a goal in general on these sites tends to tell us that it is a diet. Intuitive eating is not a diet, and it is not intended to help you lose weight. So if you're seeing something masquerading as intuitive eating and telling you that you can lose weight on this, eating plan or whatever they're saying in the same breath, it's pretty safe to say it's a diet. Any other questions about that, Jillian?
Yeah, Chloe, I have one more. Someone's asking about needing to lose weight for medical reasons.
Yeah, so I would encourage you to check out our other webinars on health at every size. We talk quite a bit about that in a few other webinars that we've hosted. So health at every size is the approach that we take here at Balance. I'll talk a little tiny bit about it later, but it's actually been scientifically shown that a health at every size perspective, which focuses on improving health through health-oriented behaviors and not focusing on the number on the scale, actually is more supportive to our health, both in the long and short term. And this is looking at health through a broader spectrum and understanding that all parts of our health kind of interact with each other. So not just saying I'm looking at physical health in a vacuum, we really need to say mental health, social health, physical health, spiritual health, all of these things kind of interact with each other to create our overall picture of health. So oftentimes if a doctor, or if someone is telling you you need to lose weight and follow this diet for the sake of health, that's really not taking into consideration most aspects of your health and can be more detrimental in the long run. So again, I encourage you to check out our other webinars that we've hosted about health at every size in specific. And I'll share a couple of resources at the end that can help you dive a little bit more deeply into that philosophy at the end as well. Great question. Anything else, Jillian?
That's it for now. Thank you so much.
Okay, awesome. Thanks. I love answering questions, so definitely feel free to keep adding them in the Q&A, everybody. And so then just finally, these goals are always, or almost always, very high pressure, perfectionistic. So it's kind of this black and white thinking of either I've hit my goal or I haven't hit my goal. When in actuality, we know that life is usually in the gray area, and maybe there's room to say, this is a continuous process. It's always growing and changing. And how do I feel on any given day, rather than diet culture saying, did you meet your points for the day or did you not? Jillian, is someone coming asking?
About fasting, right? She's there's a provider here who has a client that fasts for spiritual health. She's asking how she could speak to her about maybe changing her thinking.
Yeah, I think that's such a great question, and that is one of the harder areas for us to think about this, right? So I know here at Balance, we have had experiences with clients who are engaging in that, a religious fast or a spiritual fast, whether that's like a long-term situation. Sometimes I've seen people fasting for, very long periods of time. And some others may be fasting for a day or a week, something like that, for a specific religious or spiritual holiday. So what I think, generally speaking, a good approach is if that person has a spiritual or religious leader that they trust, seeing how they feel about either speaking with that person themselves or kind of enlisting your help in speaking with that person to see what their thoughts are. So if this person is experiencing an eating disorder or disordered eating, and they're choosing to fast or whatever it might be for spiritual or religious reasons, more often than not, that person's spiritual leader is going to be in full support of them skipping that fast for the sake of their health. And if that's not the case, then that's a great opportunity for us to provide that psychoeducation to more people, right? To those spiritual and religious leaders. If maybe this person isn't particularly part of a specific spiritual community or religious community and are just kind of making this choice for themselves, I think that warrants further exploration as to if that is rooted in the eating disorder at all, because it seems likely that it would be. So I hope that helps answer the question.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Definitely. Anything else before I keep moving?
We have a question here that I'm going to save for the end.
Okay.
So we could go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Jillian. So some disordered resolutions that diet culture has taught you. So these are, right, I think the most common ones that especially we see advertised. So hit a certain number on the scale, make up for the holidays, sometimes using disordered behaviors like counting calories or things like that, losing a certain amount of weight. All of these are completely disordered resolutions that diet culture wants you to believe are just normalized and in the pursuit of health. They're also usually really radical changes that diet culture is telling you to make, even like the ones that we saw on the earlier slide, of these big dramatic changes of, I'm going to read 100 books in a year, I think is the first one that we gave. Although that might not seem like it's related to dieting at all, these really lofty, perfectionistic, and radical goals kind of do still have roots in diet culture, because it's kind of setting you up to believe that there is something to fix about you, and there is something that can be sold to you to help fix that. The false promise more often than not is that changing your body is going to change your life. And of course, we know that that is not true. Changing your body shape or size rarely is what anyone truly needs. And I think, this is a great place to continue exploring with your team if you're feeling like that is a thought or a belief that you're holding, whether that's a therapist, a dietitian, even a primary care provider, if that's somebody that you trust. I think that can be a great place to keep exploring that belief. So diets and science. Why don't diets work? And why do we even take this non-diet approach in general? So we know that 95% of people who choose to go on diets end up regaining the weight that they lost, and sometimes even more than that. So I want to have a big disclaimer here that when I say that, that's not to say that gaining weight is a bad thing. It's simply to say that people who choose to enter some kind of diet are usually doing so with the pursuit of losing weight. So if we're thinking about it from that perspective, we know that especially in the long term, 95% of people, and some studies have even shown more than that, are unable to maintain that. And that's not because of a personal failing, that's because that's just how our bodies are designed. So again, we have some other webinars that are talking about this in more specific, but our bodies have many built-in mechanisms to make weight loss really challenging. Our bodies see weight loss as a threat. And this comes way back from, how we began evolutionarily. We were often in environments where there wasn't enough food. So if we were losing weight, that was a big threat. So our bodies are actually designed to offset that and to do things like increase your hunger if you are, restricting the intake that you have or losing weight, doing things like changing around some hunger fullness hormones, doing things like changing your metabolism even. So there's a bunch of reasons that diets don't work, and none of them are personal failings, and all of them are just the way that your body is designed to protect you. There's also something called set point weight theory. Not to keep promoting the other webinars we've already done, but there is a great webinar that one of our other dietitians, Quinn, did all about set point theory. So I really encourage everybody to check that out. But set point theory basically is the idea that we all have a genetically predetermined kind of weight range of where our bodies are destined to land. It's a genetic blueprint of what our body shapes and sizes are going to look like. Similar to how we all have a shoe size, similar to how we all have an eye color that we were always going to have because of our genetic predetermination. The same goes for our body shape and size. So if we're really trying to push against that, our body is going to resist that, right? It's not in our genetic blueprint to be in a different body size than where our bodies want to naturally land. And this is another place that I think diet culture guising as health can be such a detriment, because clearly if we're doing something that's pushing back against what our genetic predisposition is telling us to do, that can have consequences on our true health and wellness. So what are some alternatives to diet culture? So the biggest one, and one of my favorite topics in the world, is intuitive eating. Intuitive eating is sometimes called the opposite of dieting or the anti-diet. And that's because, as I mentioned in answering one of the audience questions a little bit earlier, is that instead of focusing on some outside rules telling you what, when, or how much to eat, we're listening to our own intuition and letting our own selves guide what, when, and how much we eat. We have these cues within us, such as hunger, fullness, cravings, and then some other reasons that we sometimes choose to eat as well that are really fantastic indicators of our body sending us the message that it either needs energy, has received enough energy, needs a particular kind of nutrient, so on and so forth. Just in the way that we have a biological urge to fall asleep if we're really tired, or use the restroom if we've had some water to drink, our hunger and fullness cues are really similar to that. I want to say that often there are nuances here. And one in particular that I always like to kind of pick out is for some individuals who are in recovery from an eating disorder, using those hunger and fullness cues sometimes can be a challenge, either because they're not particularly reliable at certain points in recovery, or because maybe those hunger and fullness cues are completely absent. So intuitive eating is something that can be a longer term recovery goal, while there are principles of it that can be taken into consideration a little bit earlier on in recovery. In particular, principle 1 of intuitive eating is reject the diet mentality, which I hope I've kind of sent the message that that's a great starting place for any of us. And like I mentioned as well in a question earlier, non-diet or health at every size methods, and health at every size and intuitive eating really do go hand in hand in a lot of ways, have been shown to improve health markers, both in the long and short term, more so than dieting measures do. Looks like there's a question, Jillian.
Yeah, I think this is a good time. Someone's asking about intuitive eating. There's, for medical reasons, certain food groups that they cannot eat. So they're wondering on any tips to kind of avoid these foods without restriction and still continuing to intuitively eat with those diet restrictions.
Totally. And this is such a great question. First and foremost, I'd like to say that if you have a really specific case, and if you're dealing with something that's really individualized, I would encourage you to reach out for some support and see if there is a provider you can work with that's kind of aligned with intuitive eating, who can help you navigate your specific situation. But broadly speaking, we know that people who do have some kind of conditions or disease states that are requiring some kind of dietary alterations can still use an intuitive eating approach. So a big part of intuitive eating is just understanding how our specific bodies, your specific body, interacts with the food that you're eating. So just like some people do fine with lactose and other people are lactose intolerant, it's not saying that lactose is a bad food. It's saying that some people just don't respond particularly well to it. So while theoretically they could still choose to eat foods that contain lactose, it wouldn't be necessarily listening to their own body's intuition to eat that food all of the time. Now, of course, if they're having a strong craving for that food, maybe that can be considered a little bit more closely in that one specific instance. But instead of, thinking of the foods I can't eat are bad foods, thinking of my body doesn't respond particularly well to these sorts of foods because of this specific condition that I have, that's not a restriction for a dietary or like weight loss oriented reason. It's a restriction or a change I might need to make to my dietary pattern to make me feel the best. Intuitive eating really isn't just about saying you can have, whatever, regardless of how it makes you feel. It's listening to your own intuition, and that will certainly be a component of that. So I hope that helps. We'll keep going. So what are some more supportive resolutions? So some things to think about could be read one book every month. That's certainly a lot different from the read 100 books this year resolution that we saw at the beginning. Travel to one new destination this year. Learn to cook something from your heritage. Start a daily gratitude practice, something like that. So these really would be, if you do enter the new year feeling like it would be fun to set a little goal for myself for this year, and choosing to do so in a way that isn't aligned with diet culture and is really tapping into the things that you enjoy doing in the ways that you might enhance your well-being in ways that have nothing to do with your body shape or size. So these are, of course, just a few small examples that I thought of, and you might have some as well. I would love to actually hear some people's other resolutions if they want to share them in the chat. So SMART goals is something that can be helpful in allowing us to think a little bit more specifically about our goals and help us take these from like the January New Year's resolution that I think we've all heard the statistics that by a few weeks into the new year, these resolutions go out the window, from, you know, this short-term goal into a longer-term change that maybe we're making to enhance our well-being over the longer term. So a SMART goal is a goal that is specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound. I have my cheat sheet here because sometimes I forget exactly what that acronym stands for. But basically, it's saying taking these goals from really broad to the more concrete. So instead of saying, I'm going to cut back on spending, it's saying, I'm going to take these specific steps on these specific timeframes, maybe even to reach this specific goal while you're cutting back on spending, for example. So you really have a template of what that will look like for you, and then it can be extrapolated and kind of adjusted over time so you can take that into the longer term instead of it just being a quick, fleeting January resolution.
So we have one question about goal setting and diet culture, actually. Are all physical goals aligned with diet culture?
So I guess I would want to know what this person is thinking of a little bit more, but I guess broadly speaking, I would say not necessarily. I would encourage you to think about why you're setting these physical goals. If we're thinking of a physical goal such as I want to improve my endurance so I can play with my children in the backyard, something like that. That is not a diet cultured goal unless we're saying I want to improve my endurance by losing weight, for example, or by restricting certain foods. We can definitely have goals that improve our physical well-being that aren't rooted in diet culture, but it can be a slippery slope. So if you have anybody in your life who you feel is a support system for like navigating the diet culture that we're surrounded with, I would encourage you to reach out to those people and really bounce some ideas off of them about how you might set a goal for yourself that is both doing what you want to do and meeting those goals for reasons that aren't so rooted in diet culture.
Anything for now? Yeah, this last one I'll ask at the end. Thank you.
Okay, absolutely. So just like I said, that was a perfect segue, Jillian. Reaching out for support. So many people are impacted by diet culture. You're absolutely not alone. We are constantly swimming in diet culture. It's just the society that we currently live in. So I never want anybody to feel like they're alone in this, or that they have to navigate these challenges by themselves. So we know that group support can be really helpful in this context, just for building that sense of community and really understanding that you're not alone. When I've led intuitive eating groups in the past, one of the biggest takeaways, we always talked about takeaways at the last session of the group, pretty much everybody always said, it's so nice to see that there are other people who feel the way that I feel and who are navigating the same challenges with diet culture that I am. And that can be really powerful to feel like you do have your community and your tribe who's navigating through this with you. We do offer group support here at Balance. We have a number of different groups, from the PHP level of care all the way down to more individualized or outpatient levels of care, just like Ekin said at the beginning. So I encourage anybody who's potentially interested to check that out. Even if you know the information, it can be really hard to put it into practice sometimes. We can, talk here all about what intuitive eating is, what rejecting diet culture is, and without the support, sometimes it's just a little bit challenging to put into practice on your own. So if you're feeling like you've been thinking about reaching out for some support, this could be a good time to do it. And that actually could be a great little New Year's goal in and of itself, is finally reaching out for some support if you've been thinking of doing so. So just to wrap up before we get into the rest of our questions, a few anti-diet resources. So a couple of books that I wanted to point out, two by Lindo Bacon. One is Health at Every Size and the other is Body Respect. These are phenomenal books that are diving into the health at every size research and how we can implement that into our own lives. So whomever that was that asked about health at every size or losing weight to try to change their physical health, these can be some great ones for you to check out. Intuitive Eating, the 5th edition just came out. I guess now it was 2 years ago, which this is flying by. But the 5th edition came out, and I believe it was 2020. That has the newer research. Of course, any edition would be great, but that's by Evelyn Tribole and Elise Resch. Anti-Diet by Christy Harrison is a little bit, I would say, less academic of a text around the same kind of ideas of health at every size and intuitive eating. Everybody really loves that book who's read it. And we have a couple of Instagram channels ourselves, both Balance and Redefining Wellness. Encourage you to check those out, especially if you're feeling like it would be helpful to refill your feed with more supportive content and replacing some of that diet cultured content. And last but certainly not least is the support group that we host here a couple of times a month at Balance. I'm guessing someone will probably put more information on that into the chat, but we do host that free support group, so individuals can feel free to join us and kind of share in that sense of community like we were talking about a little bit before. Jillian, any other questions?
Yes, we have a few. One of them is related to the resources you just went over. We have someone asking about if you recommend the book Sick Enough by Jennifer Giudiani.
Yes, so absolutely. I mean, that's a book that I think all of us here at Balance have read, and it's an absolutely outstanding book. Dr. Gaudiani is one of the most incredible doctors in the field of eating disorders. She goes into the real nitty-gritty of the health implications that different eating disorders can have. So if you're interested in that, that is certainly a fantastic book for you to check out.
Hey, thanks. And we have another question. Someone's asking about emotional eating. I think they're asking how you differentiate emotional eating from intuitive eating.
Definitely. So great question. So one of the principles of intuitive eating really does talk about emotional eating. We all eat for emotional reasons, and it's a very normal thing that all of us do from time to time. And really the way that intuitive eating delineates that is that if eating or using food as a coping strategy feels like the only coping strategy that you have to navigate challenging situations or emotions. So if it is, that just shows that there's a little bit of space maybe to think about what some other coping strategies could be for you to build. And oftentimes talking with a therapist, talking with an intuitive eating aligned dietitian can be really helpful in coming up with those strategies and game planning around that. But again, I really want to emphasize that we all eat for emotional reasons from time to time, and that can be part of a very neutral relationship with food.
And the last question, so this person likes to move their body for just anxiety reasons. However, the anxiety and the mental health is also connected to the size and weight. Like thoughts, so is there, any tips on kind of using exercise just for the anxiety, but kind of detaching it from the body size weight aspect?
Yeah, I think that's a phenomenal question. A lot of people do choose to use some form of movement as a way to mitigate anxiety. I would say definitely take a moment and just check in with your relationship with movement and make sure that it feels like there isn't anything wrapped up in that is kind of detrimental or related to any disordered eating or eating disorder behavior. Then to kind of take that a step further and to try to separate those two things. I think generally speaking, doing some thought replacement is a great strategy that a lot of people find success with. So what this would look like is every time you're about to go for a walk or whatever your form of movement is to try to mitigate some of that anxiety, to really say to yourself, I'm choosing to do this for XYZ reasons that are maybe supportive to your mental health and not aligned with diet culture. So to get in the way of my anxiety, to enjoy a sunny day, maybe not right now, maybe it's not going to be a warm and sunny day in January, but at some point, hopefully it will be. So really thinking of these more productive reasons that you're choosing to engage in movement, if it's something that, that you choose to do. And if the thoughts come up around, oh, and it'll be great that I'm doing this because maybe my body shape or size will change, really taking a moment to acknowledge the thought that thought came up in the first place, and then choosing to do the thought replacement again. So really it's helpful if in that particular moment that you're having that thought, if you can think about the counter thoughts or the more productive or healthy thoughts, we really are doing that active thought replacement, which is sending the message to our brains and to our bodies that putting on, leggings to go for a walk, for example, doesn't mean we have to think thoughts about changing our body shape or size, and it can really be this positive experience. Any other questions? If anyone has anything else, please feel free to drop them in the chat. We do have a couple of minutes. Okay. So if anybody thinks of anything, please feel free to drop it in the Q&A. But last but not least, I did want to just mention that we do offer discovery calls here at Balance. Ekin, did you want to tell our attendees more about that?
Yeah, I added the link in the chat, but for an individualized conversation, 20-minute free consultation with either admissions therapists or intake coordinators, please feel free to click on that link. You can choose the day and time. Really, the conversation goes wherever you want it to go. It's really just to discuss, your journey in this and how we can best support you in recovery. And as always, keep an eye out for our emails. There's a lot of exciting announcements coming up. And like we had said in the chat, we have the free support groups twice a month, several webinars up and coming. Great stuff.
Yeah. One last question for you, Chloe. Someone's asking about how do you navigate setting boundaries with close family and friends that are really into diet culture?
Yeah. I mean, that is such a fantastic question. A webinar I did a few months ago at this point, which is up on the YouTube channel as well. We do talk a little bit more about boundary setting, but just for a quick overview of like what boundaries are and how we can try to set them. You have what works best for you and is what's most supportive to you, et cetera, et cetera. And then the people that we surround ourselves with have that own version of what that might look like for themselves. So we know that we can more likely change our own mindset or our own behaviors in order to interact with that situation, kind of bridge that gap more so than we can change someone else's thoughts or behaviors, at least in the short term. So I always say if you can give them a copy of Body Respect or Intuitive Eating, that's really helpful, hopefully in educating them a little bit. But in the more short term of maybe, this weekend when you see your family member and you're concerned that they might have a comment, really taking the time before you head into that situation with whomever that person might be in your life to say, what is my bandwidth for dealing with these comments that might come up today? Sometimes it'll look like, I feel up to really countering the thoughts that they're sharing. So I feel really up to saying, hey, that's rooted in diet culture, and I'd be happy to talk more about what diet culture is. Some days it'll look like saying, I can't have this conversation. I'm choosing to not have this conversation with you today. Some days it'll look like changing the topic of conversation at hand. So it's going to be different every single day. And that's why we really do have to check in with ourselves going into that experience to see where you're at on any given day. And of course, in the long term, trying to help out with that education can be really helpful, and just having your own support network too. So if you know that every single time you see this person who's unavoidable to see. You want to see them, but every time you leave feeling not so great, identify who your support network is that you can reach out to afterwards so you can get a little bit of emotional support around that, and choose your self-care activities that help you feel a little bit more centered and positive as well.
Yes, such a great game plan.
Thank you.
If you guys have any other questions, please feel free to pop it in. We've got a few more minutes on our hands.
And we really want to hear from you. So if you don't forget to schedule that 20-minute consultation in the chat.
Yeah, most definitely. We are here to chat for however long you need after this as well. And I also popped in our phone number. You can always give our main line just a call for a quick call as well.
And while we wait to see if any more questions come in as we wrap up, I just want to say thank you to everybody for attending today and for listening to this. I think this is such an important topic for us to all think about as we navigate this new year landscape. So a real thank you for attending and for being such an active participant today. And thank you to our moderators too. It's been so helpful to have you all fielding questions in the chat.
Chloe, I want to call attention to Mary's question. I think that might be something, Mary, that if you want to call in and have a private conversation with, the team would be able to give you some really concrete and specific support for yourself. But if you'd like to try to answer, Chloe, Mary was asking about how you can deal with disliking the way that you look while in recovery and gaining weight or otherwise.
Yeah, great question. So I think this is a place that individualized support is really critical. It's common for thoughts like this to come up while you are navigating recovery. So oftentimes having a specialized therapist, in particular psychiatrist and dietitian, can be really helpful in helping you navigate the specific thoughts that are coming up for you. Again, I'm going to promote another webinar that we do have on the Balance YouTube. Our amazing body image expert, Danny Bryant, did a webinar about body acceptance. I think it's called Body Acceptance 101. So hopefully that's easy to find. But she shares some really phenomenal and concrete tips for helping you navigate that.
Yeah. So we have another one. Is there a TV show or a movie that you know of that's a good representation of breaking diet culture? Interesting question.
Ooh, what a fun question.
Yeah.
Let's see, movie or TV show in particular, I would have to put my thinking cap on. I'm not the biggest movie or TV watcher, but I can say the podcast Maintenance Phase is incredible at debunking all of this diet culture garbage that exists in our society. They really debunk with concrete research and everything like that. So if you haven't checked out that podcast, that is one that I recommend.
I think that is a wrap, folks. Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye, guys.